Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Lavin. I'm with the Secretariat that supports the Indigenous Child and Family Services Directors Society. I'm calling in today from very snowy traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I'm going to start by handing things over to Kelly McReynolds so that she can start us off in a good way. Welcome, Kelly.
Squal Tanayap, Kelly McReynolds from Squamish Nation. And I just wanted to wish you a good welcome here this afternoon from the traditional territories of the Squamish people. I wish you all good health, love, and prayers of strength and I offer prayers up to all those that are sick and suffering and the grief and loss. Dear ancestors, grandmothers and grandfathers, we ask that you be with us today as we begin with open hearts and open minds. We look to the east where the sun comes up with our new beginnings, hope, promise, and potential. We look to the south for warmth, growth, creativity, and productivity. Please bring us the faith, trust, and good relationship. We pray for all these things this day. We look to the west as the sun goes down to bring us rest, dream lives, and closure to good days and for many more new beginnings. We look to the north for strength, courage, fortitude, and focus for our purpose. We look up and we pray that our hearts and our minds and our soul and our spirit never forget to give gratitude for each day. We look to Mother Earth and we pray that all we do this day will be in honor and reverence for our communities, our children, youth, and families. We look inwards to our hearts as we give and do all that is true with love and care each day.
Thank you, Kelly. I'll do some quick introductions before we get started. We have 3 panel members joining us today. We have, of course, Cindy Blackstock, who really needs no introduction. She's, among many other things, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Welcome, Cindy. We also have Mary Teegee, who's the Chair of the Indigenous Child and Family Services Directors Society, and she's the Executive Director at Carriacicani Family Services and a board member of the Caring Society as well. And we also have Helaina Gaspard, the Director of Governance and Institutions at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. And many of you will be familiar with her work on the Measuring to Thrive framework. I'll hand it over now to Mary for some opening thoughts, and then Cindy will take us through a bit of a historical overview.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here on this very momentous day. And I just want to thank from the bottom of my heart, Dr. Cindy Blackstock and Dr. Helaina Gaspard for being here today. Of course, British Columbia, we're going to be the first to have these 2 experts with us to walk us through the agreement in principle, the historic agreement of $40 billion. I know how hard Dr. Blackstock has worked over the years, and it just brings tears to my eyes. And bringing Dr. Helaina Gaspard and the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, the amount of work that we've undertaken to get to this day has been years and years in the making, almost 15 years. So I just want to commend them. But before we start, I think it's really important that for everybody that's on this call to understand that when we were in the negotiations room, getting this agreement in principle, at the very beginning, Honorable Murray Sinclair had asked us, all the parties in the room, to ask us what our vision was. And of course, Cindy always, it's always about our children. We always say that that's why the society was created. That's why we launched this court case. Was for the children and the betterment of our people. So instead of doing what our vision of success was around the money or whatever, Cindy took it to a place where it was coming through the eyes of a child, and we were committing to the children. So this was our vision of success that we gave to the parties under the direction of Honorable Sinclair. I'm just going to summarize it. This case is about loving justice for you and your families, and it will only be achieved when your lives are better, when your families receive the help they need to embrace their multi-generational cultural strength to face the multi-generational trauma imposed on them, when you do not have to apply for services that other children and young people get as a matter of course, when the help offered is what you need and available when you need it, when young people in care can grow up strong and proud, and when their 18th birthday no longer means they will be on their own, when the government accepts responsibility for hurting the children and those who love them, when you don't have to worry so much about the government hurting you or your own children one day because they show us all that they learn from this and we have safeguards to catch things when they don't. Our promise to you is that we will push for full implementation of the legal orders. We will always remember the sacrifice of the residential school and 60 Scoop survivors who told their truth so that you could live the lives they and their ancestors dreamt for you. We will be honest, we will work based on the best ideas and evidence. We will work with others, we will say when we are wrong, we will take nothing that is yours, and we will always keep you at the center when we make the hard decisions that come our way. As much as we wish otherwise, some of the injustice will remain long after we are gone. That is why we are working with children, youth, and teachers of all diversities to educate them so that they can stand in loving solidarity with you to achieve justice for you, for them, and for the land. We will do our best for you because we love you. That is a duty we owe to the ancestors and to the residential school and 60 Scoop survivors who passed down the best of who they were to us so that we have this chance to make the world better for you. You are the writers of our time in history. It is not you, not us, who decides if we kept our pledge. If we really put you first, if we tried hard enough, if we gave up too early or fought too long, this and more will be told when you hold the pen of history. We will also keep spirit in the room to keep an eye on what we will pray for. To all the adults in the room who share this sacred duty with us, let's think carefully about why we are here. We are the echoes and the realities of many generations of children to follow. We must do them right and make them proud. Many years after we are gone, children will tell stories of us, they will dance about us, they will sing about us. What do we want them to say? And that was our vision of success when we were in the negotiations. So I'm just so happy to be here. And with that, we will start the session.
Thank you, Mary. And I just want to say how grateful I am to all of you. This is a collective work, as Mary said, and so many people over the decades have set the groundwork for this success. And Mary has been a big champion of kids in and outside of that negotiating room. But, you know, people hear the 40 billion and sometimes in the press, they actually characterize it incorrectly as a class action. It actually isn't a class action, not all of it, not most of it, in fact. It all flows from work that we had done together. Some of you will remember in as early as 2000, where we found that the federal government was underfunding First Nations children by about 70 cents on the dollar. So they were giving 70 cents to a First Nations child in child welfare, but you know, versus $1 for everybody else. And those inequalities were mostly in the area of keeping families together. I mean, there was almost nothing there. The government agreed with that. They agreed with the report. They agreed with the reforms. They just didn't do it. They said they needed another more detailed report. So we did that again. And by then the inequalities had grown. They had gotten deeper. And sadly, so had the trauma for the families, right? When you don't get in there with supports when they need them, the trauma gets worse. So it's when Canada didn't implement that second report that we went to the Chiefs-in Assembly and we got the resolution for the Caring Society and AFN to file that human rights complaint. Now, the human rights complaint alleged that Canada's underfunding of First Nations children's services and its failure to implement Jordan's principle was racially discriminatory. And many of you remember at the time that other than First Nations, almost nobody was watching. And that started to change, particularly around about 2009. And a big shout out to APTN for broadcasting the hearings, because without them kind of putting the story out there, I'm not sure the mainstream media would have really grabbed onto it. Canada fought this case tooth and nail. Like there's no way, no point during 2007 and 2009 that they conceded that they are discriminating. In fact, far from it. They actually challenged this case on jurisdictional grounds. They said, for example, that it's not fair to the federal government to compare services on and off reserve. They said it's not fair to the federal government to say that they're discriminating. They're only funding the service. If there's any discrimination happening, it's the First Nations or the agencies that are discriminating because they're providing the services, which of course is ridiculous. If you don't have the money, you won't be able to provide the same level of services as everyone else. When we finally got to the hearing and the tribunal made its ruling on January 26, 2016, the evidence was so overwhelming that Canada was discriminating. And that's what the tribunal found. It found that Canada was discriminating and it ordered Canada to immediately cease its discriminatory practices and to reform the First Nations Child and Family Service Program funding, and also to fully implement Jordan's Principle. The government sent out ministers to welcome the decision. And then, of course, they didn't do anything. So we've had between 2016 and 2021, 20 non-compliance and procedural orders. It's actually up to 21 now. And as recently as September, the federal government was taking the position that the discrimination was historical, that everything was fixed now. It was only after the federal court dismissed 2 of Canada's appeals, one on compensation for the children that had been harmed by Canada's discrimination, and the other on Jordan's Principle for kids recognized by their nations off reserve. It's only when they lost that, and with the public pressure fueled by the spirits of the children in unmarked graves and the residential school survivors and youth in care, and many of you on this call, the public pressure got too much, and the federal government then says, okay, well, we're going to file an appeal in the Federal Court of Appeal on compensation. We won't file an appeal on Jordan's Principle eligibility. Those First Nations kids off reserve recognized by their nations can continue to receive services. And then they announced they wanted to go into this negotiation period. So we went into that space. I went in there with good faith, but very mindful of Canada's long history of non-compliance. We have now reached this agreement in principle. It's non-binding. We are signatories only to the one on First Nations Child and Family Service Reform and Jordan's Principle. And there's another aspect of this, which I'll get to later in my talk, and that is about fixing the department itself so that it doesn't hurt another generation of kids. So that's us. There's another agreement in principle on compensation. It includes AFN. It includes another class action group called the Motion Group and Canada. And they have reached an agreement in principle on compensation, which we will describe a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, what's going to happen is one of the conditions for this is you, Canada, need to change things for children now. So we are going to be filing at the tribunal a consent order that will ensure, as of April 1st, all First Nations in BC across the country will receive $2,500 per person on reserve. That's not per child, that's per person on reserve for prevention funding. You will, as a nation, decide where you want to direct that funding. It could be to the First Nations agency. It could be to a wellness clinic or a youth center. It could be a variety of service providers, but that is going to happen. And then the other thing that's going to kick in on April 1st is young people who have aged out of care or are aging out of care between the ages of 18 and 26 will get post-majority supports. This is so critical, as you know, because for far too long, First Nations young people, when they aged out of care, there was no money to support them. And so they're very vulnerable at that young age. And so there will be supports for things. And we have been working with Youth in Care to advise us on this. And they're looking for things like housing, of course, mental health supports, support culture and language supports, and then basic and pragmatic things like cooking classes. So that kind of money will also kick in on April 1st, along with some money for capital. Then over the summer and fall, we have to reach a binding agreement with Canada with some kind of check mechanism to hold it accountable after the tribunal ceases jurisdiction. I want the tribunal to hold on to jurisdiction until we can do the community work that's necessary to reform the program. And Helaina is going to go through that. But the more specific the legal order is that the final one the tribunal issues, the more easy it's going to be for a First Nation after this case to hold Canada to account. So on April 1st, you can plan to get this prevention money. It's not just for agencies, it's for all the First Nations. And also that Jordan's principle, we're looking at assessing how we support young people who are receiving Jordan's principle services, how we bridge those young people into young adulthood. So we're hoping to get to a final agreement by November 30th, 2022 with Canada. I think that's might be too early because of the pandemic and because of the natural crises that you know too well in BC. We want to make sure that the priority is that communities have time to participate, to understand what's going on, and to help shape this final solution. So that's key. Next slide, please. One caution I want to say is Canada's current position is that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders that are binding on Canada and for which all this money is flowing from does not apply to First Nations that draw down jurisdiction. Now, one of the things we've been saying is, well, that's not fair because affirming jurisdiction under C-92 shouldn't mean you get less or a worse funding system. But the reality is that Canada has been handing out funding packages that are inferior, in my view, to what is available through the CHRT process. And it's not the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that's requiring delegation as a condition of funding. It's the federal government. So there would be a need for political support to make sure that as an option, First Nations who draw down jurisdiction could operate under the existing orders and requirements, especially the capital order that was just rendered. And it would be, you know, Canada's taking the position it doesn't apply to C-92. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Helaina Gaspard.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you for having me join you today. It's a pleasure to be with you and all of the good folks in BC. So I wanted to give you some context for some of the information, for some of the perspective that we hope will come from, as Cindy noted, that longer term final agreement, building from that agreement in principle. And as a number of you will know, the core of the approach that we worked with a number of you to develop, and with Cindy and with Mary and a host of others across the country, was actually to define an approach to funding child and family services that's consistent with the overall goal of well-being. And so when we asked you and we asked your colleagues what that should look like, time and time again, we heard the same thing, that it has to be about children, it has to be about families, and that it has to be about communities. And that any funding associated to child and family services should address those causes of contact with the protection system, but also importantly, ensure that those providing the services, that agencies, that First Nations have the resources they need and the ability to use the resources however flexibly they need to be able to work toward that future focused goal of well-being. And so in the Measuring to Thrive framework, there are a number of indicators that are clustered or bucketed into child well-being, family well-being, and community well-being. And when we think about the community well-being piece, that for us really is the framework. Where are you starting? Where are you living? What's your environment like? Do you have enough housing? Do you have access to broadband? Do you have those basic building blocks, those basic tools to ensure that your children and your families can grow up well and healthy and, excited and hopeful for the future? That's the point of departure. And then when we ask about families, do they feel like they have connections? Do they feel like they have a support network if things don't go well? And also for children, children make up the biggest part of the framework. And it's asking not only how many times a child moves if ever they're in contact with the protection system, or how many times a child is in contact with the system itself, but it's about asking, how is the child doing? Are they meeting, basic pedagogical targets? Are they healthy and developing well physically and spiritually and emotionally? Are they connected to their First Nation, to their communities? Do they take part in their cultural practices? Are they proud of it? Do they have the opportunities to learn their Indigenous language or languages and take part in, the practices and the culture of, those around them? And so that for us makes up the point of departure for any conversation about money moving forward. And that's a really important message from our perspective, that the way the money moves is really secondary to how you can build and achieve well-being for children. The question for us has always been, how do you achieve that well-being? And then what resources do you need to get there? And we're very hopeful that thanks to so many of your contributions, we can work collectively to ensure that these resources can move in a way that's useful to all of you that do such important work on the ground.
That's me, I guess. So I think some of the principles that we really ensured that was in the AIP for long-term reform, of course, was no more discrimination. Again and again, our bottom line was there was 3 points that we would keep hammering home. One was that discrimination had to end now. Discrimination could not occur again. And a third thing was compensation, and we never deviated from that. So in the long-term reform, of course, the no more discrimination. And as we know, across Canada, there's still areas where discrimination is still occurring as we speak. So we have to ensure that discrimination ends. All the funding, it has to be culturally appropriate. And we say that because I think even in the early arguments at the tribunal, when we were defining what prevention was, especially here in BC, if you recall back in 2007, 2008, when we did the Made in BC Enhanced Prevention Framework, that was definitely something that we heard again at the time when we were doing the consultation all those years ago. All of that information that we received, that I received at the time, I brought that back up to the society. So the importance of culture again and again, as prevention was loud and clear. Again, focus on prevention rather than listening to what Helaina was talking about and Cindy, to understand that in the early years that for those that really don't understand the early years, is that Canada funded us on a funding model that was not based on need. It was based on per capita for children on reserve, and that was it. So those prevention dollars now, again, we're basing it on the need as found from in the Measuring to Thrive, but also based on the need in each of your communities. What is it? And we know that each community is going to be different, and so this funding is flexible enough to allow for that. Based on substantive equality, again, that was huge for us. Again, there's Jordan's principle that's reflected in here, that every child has access to all services that any other child has access to. I think it's also important to note that the reasons why children are going into care, it's not necessarily abuse. It's usually what we call the term neglect. And again, what does that mean? The issues of poverty, the issues of housing, all of those issues should not be reasons for children going into care. So definitely that was one of the principles that we wanted to ensure that was in the AIP. Of course, addressing the interests and the needs of the children. That is, again, it's the best interest of your children, where they're at and from your communities, and to really reflect and celebrate the cultural norms of your area. And so definitely that the funding, we needed to make that a principle and account for the unique circumstances. We know that living remotely in North Island, the transportation issues that you have is different than, say, living in a closer nation that's closer to a municipality that may have access to more services. So we're ensuring that the AIP, that as best as we can, is accounting for those unique circumstances. One thing I just wanted to point out is that when we talk about this agreement in principle, and we talk about baseline funding, that BC is very unique throughout the rest of the country because we didn't receive prevention funding until it only started flowing, I would say, probably in 2018 and then 2019. So we're still developing prevention programs. We're still developing good mechanisms to get funding to the communities. We're still doing all of these things because we never received prevention dollars before. So that's something to consider. And it's definitely something that I will be bringing to the table and the work that we need to go to get to the final settlements. Next slide, please. So the funding approach, again, the supporting the holistic wellness. This, again, it's huge. So already we've heard across the country where, unfortunately, some of the funding service officers, the Indigenous Service Canada, are telling people that this is not a child and family expense, that it isn't eligible, like ineligible and eligible expenses. So when we looked at what is prevention to us, of course, as Indigenous people, it's holistic and it follows the life cycle approach. If you have a healthy baby, you have a healthy child, healthy adult, healthy parent, and therefore you'll have a healthy family, healthy community. So that's really what we really hammered on to make sure that the nations, if you're going to say, okay, early childhood is part of child and family, and that supports the holistic wellness of the family, well, that should be fundable. Again, addressing the root causes and structural drivers, as I talked about earlier. Those I know that Cindy always brings this up, and we have the Spirit Fair plan. And for those leaders that haven't read the Spirit Fair plan, just download it, print it off, and have it on your desk, because that's where we need to get to. Because basically, a child should not be removed for things that are beyond that child or the family's control. Issues of poverty, issues of housing, also those root causes. We can't forget. Again, we're here because the impacts of colonization and the impacts of residential school. So trauma-informed practices is what we're going to need. Mental health supports for our children and youth, and family supports for our families. So just to consider, why are we in this situation? And then we have the control and now the resources to address those root causes and structural drivers. So the leverage intergenerational cultural child caring approaches. Again, your community knows best. It is your culture, it is your stories, it is your myths and legends and everything that comes together that kept your children safe and protected. And that's sort of those principles and those ways of being is what we need to get back to. And this funding approach, we had to ensure that it allowed for us to do that. We also need to ensure that we need to really ensure that the work that we're doing is tied to something that we can measure. As leaders, we need to know that the funding and the services we're providing to our people is actually doing what we expect it to do. So we need to figure out, like, okay, if we're going to implement these activities and these programs in 5 years, are our communities doing better? What is it that we need to do? So we really thought about this, and this is why we have Dr. Helaina Gaspard and the University of Ottawa to develop, as we talked about, those indicators, so you can make good, sound decisions, so that we know that we are, overcoming the impacts of residential school. That we can say in 5 years there are now like only half of the children are in care. In 10 years, it's not only about not having children in care, but that they're thriving, that they're doing well at school. That whatever your community decides as an indicator of wellness, that you're able to measure that. Okay, next slide. Cindy.
All right, so I want to just kind of say that we're going to act on what we know now in that April 1st piece, and then we have some pieces that are in the IFSD phase 2. So that prevention at $2,500 per capita. If you are a First Nation, by the way, and you don't have an agency and you just received that amount for prevention, you'll be increased to that $2,500 per capita. So don't worry that you're not going to lose out. That will be a real opportunity, but we need to build capacity at the community level because many communities have never had this. And as Mary's pointing out, agencies have really just had this since 2018. So there's a real need to kind of let this be able to get out and do the research that Helaina's talking about what supports do you need to be able to really deliver these programs and these services in a way that makes sense. Information technology, really key. We've seen it during the pandemic. It'll be 6% of what's the baseline. Helaina can explain what the baseline is. It basically includes your child protection services, those types of things. And also results. We need to be really seeing whether or not what we're doing is changing things for kids on the ground, and I'd be really humble about that. We're going to start with our best ideas, but they may turn out not to work, and unexpected things we're doing may turn out to be fabulous. So we need to be open to all of these things. I think the key is to do right versus be right. Emergency fund. We've seen emergencies in BC. I think this is something we're going to have to really look at in phase three of the work to see if that's sufficient, because so many unexpected things are happening in First Nations communities, largely due to climate change, but also the pandemic. Poverty is one of the key reasons why First Nations kids come into care, but also I would add in there addictions, which is the multi-generational trauma. We need to really think about calibrating these services and addressing those drivers that Mary is talking about. Remoteness and geography. Remoteness is, one of the key areas that we need to explore. The Anishinaabe Nation is doing some of that work. But it's based on data from their own communities. And what we need to do is make sure whatever is available to you is based on data from your communities. And capital assets, actually having them funded in the first place, then being able to replace them and maintain them. The next thing is a national secretariat, and I would add on there regional secretariat, which is something we're pushing for, is because we know that in regions you have got capable bodies that need to be supported. But nationally, there are things that a national secretariat could help out with, kind of like the Caring Society, but in a more, also with some data management. We're saying that doesn't necessarily need to be a big organization. It could be just investing in existing organizations. We need to have a discussion about this. First Nations Representative Services, that is known to many of you as band rep services. That program is going to be actually taken national. So that if you have band reps working in your agencies who are receiving notices on behalf of your children who are removed from your families per C92, that actually will be funded. And then of course with the major capital infrastructure. Next slide. There's the post-majority care I've already talked about. And another key piece is that money will not be reduced. This was the big headache before, is that the federal government would give you money for prevention. Finally, your families are feeling better and children are not going into care at the same rate. And then they cut your prevention funding because they say you don't need it anymore. Well, that was ridiculous. So now your funding will not be reduced when the number of children in care decreases. But I really want to caution, the actual measure, the good measure, is not when your kids in care decrease, because you can do that through all kinds of ways. Provinces have done it a lot of times by just reducing the age at which kids could be in care or just discharging them. What we really want to measure is family wellness and community wellness, because when families are well, kids are well. And that means that you're really making things better for children and their families. And really building in their flexibility about how you determine your population count. Remember, we're doing prevention at $2,500 per person. Well, we've all been in a situation where the department usually has lower numbers than the groups that you're actually serving. So that's something that we need to work out. And that the actuals process, with the exception of prevention, because that'll be funded at $2,500 a person, that's going to continue. So the funding for building repairs, the funding for intake assessment, legal, all that continues until we have something else that works for people that you're going to be a part of driving. Next slide. And I'm going to turn this one over to Helaina and Mary.
So this, and we have the care scanning. So this is what we're just looking at as soon as the AIP came down, is that we're looking at coming from what are the rights of the children and youth that we have across, the right for them to know their culture, the right to be their family, the right to feel connected, the right to their lands, like all of these pieces coming from that place of a child. And then also, of course, the next piece is looking at what are the well-being, identifying those well-being indicators as Helaina and IFSD and the Measuring to Thrive framework We also need to understand what are the well-being mapped within structural drivers for each child in their environment of care. This is really important because, again, as I talked about, what may be those things that are keeping the child from being with their family, what could cause risk from their parents losing the children. So we really have to think about that. And then, of course, we're going to budget for that. So if it is housing, if it is those structural drivers, we need to allow for funding to do that. We also then we're looking at the costing in accordance with the provisions in the final settlement agreement and making those adjustments. So eventually all children we hope will experience substantive equality. Did you want to speak to that, Helaina, as well?
Maybe just very quickly, I think, Mary, something that's so important from our perspective is making sure, as you've pointed out, that everything is bottom up. Right. Yeah. And that everything starts with the community, everything starts with the First Nation. So we're not talking about a fixed amount of money that's going to be divvied up. We're talking about really flipping our understanding of asking what's needed on the ground and then building our budgets from there. And also making sure, as both Mary and Cindy have pointed out, that those factors in that budgeting approach or in that funding approach are actually dynamic. And that means that when circumstances or needs change inside of the community, so too should that funding.
Mm-hmm. I think the other piece too, when we're talking about the importance, and if you see it in the agreement in principle, is the block funding arrangement. Right now in British Columbia, I just needed like all leadership to understand is that we're really unique in a way that, well, the way that we receive prevention funding is through a business case. We provide the business case and then it gets approved, and then we have funding to do that. The rest of Canada, it's basically they have to pay for the service or whatever, and then they get reimbursed, and sometimes those expenses are ineligible. We don't have to go through that process right now in BC, which is a good thing. But the importance is the block funding, because we know, especially COVID really taught us, when we couldn't hire staff, when we couldn't do all these activities, we accumulated these massive surpluses. So there should be the ability for us to carry that forward. For the most part, we're able to do that with federal and provincial funding in the last couple of years. But really, that one of the intents of the AIP is that there would be block funding arrangements. Okay, Cindy?
Okay, the compensation can sometimes be confusing because many of us are familiar with class actions. We've seen them with residential schools, we've seen them with the 60 Scoop. But what we were able to get at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal is something very different. That's human rights damages. It's damages for the fact that you were discriminated against. And it is part of the Canadian Human Rights Act. So we were able to get via the tribunal, along with the Assembly of First Nations and everyone else, the $40,000, which is the maximum amount allowable under the Canadian Human Rights Act. That's where that number comes from. Now, the tribunal itself said that that amount is not enough for most children, given the indignities that they experienced and the harms they experienced. And suggested that, basically a class action could build on top of that for more compensation. As you know, Canada was ordered to do this in 2019 and really didn't move on it. They said, oh, we want to do this by a class action. And they never had a good answer as to why they wouldn't just pay out the 40. My own suspicion is they wanted to give these kids less and then give some kids more, kind of a shuffling of deck chairs on the Titanic. So what happened is that there were a couple of class actions filed. The first one is done in the name of Xavier Moucham and Jeremy Musqueam. And Jeremy is Marina Beadle's son. Some of you remember this courageous Mi'kmaq elder who took on Canada and actually won the very first Jordan's Principle case in federal court in 2013. This is her son. And that case was going along, and then AFN filed its own class action. So you have these two class actions, and then you have these existing orders by the tribunal. The government appealed the tribunal's order, and we argued that over the summer in June of 2021. And at the time, Canada was saying, we're not paying anything in human rights damages. They lost in federal court on September 29th, and that created a kind of a public outcry, because the Prime Minister was saying, among others, we're not fighting First Nations kids in court, when obviously they were. So that kind of left them with a problem. They either paid out this $40,000 or they got down to the negotiating table and they tried to come up with something. So we'll go to the next slide. So there's kind of under the tribunal, and I need to say I don't have all the details about how the class action people are going to distribute that 20 billion, because that is not detailed in the agreement. I'm going to get to why I think there needs to be some big protections there in a minute. But you've got basically four groups that are going to be getting compensation. Now, the class action compensation, this 20 billion, goes back to 1991. And the reason for that is that's when that crazy Directive 20-1 was rolled out. That's the formula that Mary's talking about that offered nothing in prevention. So under the CHRT, we can go back to 2006, but these class actions are going back further to 1991. But basically the same groups of people. The children who are denied necessary supports under Jordan's principle. So that's going to be the group of kids like Jordan, who are told no, right? Or many of the kids in BC who ought to have received Jordan's principle, but did not. The other group is children who are from the caregivers of children who were removed from their families because Jordan's principle wasn't put in place. A good example of this is, for example, high special needs child. The only way you could get that high special needs child services was to bring them into care. There was nothing going on in the family that would suggest they needed to be in care other than that. So that those parents or the grandparent, it's not both, it's either or, whoever was primarily caring for the child will receive some compensation. Then on the child and family services side, we have children who are unnecessarily removed. And what I mean by that is not that social workers removed them and that was the wrong decision, but they could have stayed at home had Canada not discriminated and provided the proper level of funding. They will receive compensation. And children who were, quote, as the tribunal says, necessarily removed due to sexual, physical abuse, and were placed outside of their extended family and caregivers, they will also get compensation. But the caregiver pool about compensation on children who were removed is slightly different. And that is parents of kids who are removed due to the poverty, the addictions, mental health, that kind of stuff. They'll receive compensation, but not parents who sexually, physically, or psychologically abuse the child, because we don't want to reward that kind of behavior. So, for example, the parents of Phoenix Sinclair will not get anything. So this order comes out, and Canada actually wanted to exclude the children who died in the compensation period. We had to fight that in the middle of the pandemic. We were able to get them included in this compensation package. Now, we're not sure how the Class Action Council are going to distribute this money, but I will just say what our position is. Our position is that the children who are entitled to the $40,000 in human rights damages need to receive at least that amount. And we also believe that there needs to be safeguards. Some people are saying, well, you know, okay, if we use the 40 as the floor, then how do we increase the amount? Maybe if they were sexually abused, we should find that out and cost that out. I would really caution against that. The reason is that many of these are still children. We cannot be interviewing children about their harm and costing that out. That would be so traumatizing for kids. So what we need to do is use nationally available data that is linked to what we usually know will harm kids more. Number of moves while they were in care, the age at which they were in care, that kind of thing, but no interviews of kids. The other thing that we have to do is make sure the money for children goes into trust, that it's held in trust until they become adults. And the other thing I would really urge is structured payments for young adults. And what do I mean by that? Some of these young people may be entitled to over $100,000. Instead of giving $100,000 to a young person who's really traumatized, dealing with addictions, and we all know where that could lead, to actually structure the payment so that they get a bit each year, and that they can apply. For example, if they say we had a young person who wanted to go into the trades, they could apply to get more to cover off those kinds of costs until they're age 26. And the reason this 26 comes up, and you'll remember that from post-majority care, is because we know in science that that's how long it takes for children's brains to finish developing, right? So that's why we have that there. And I've included in a link right now is the recommendations that I am putting out are really those that come from youth in care themselves. And we have worked on a report with these youth, First Nations youth, and I'm posting the first one. We'll have a second one coming out in the next couple of weeks, where they're going to provide us more guidance, not only on compensation, but on long-term reform, because we really wanted to hear from them. Next slide. So the next step is this binding agreement. We need to find out what's going on in the compensation, and hopefully we're able to find out these safeguards are all there, including mental wellness and financial literacy. For those of you who didn't see, financial literacy was a key recommendation of Youth in Care. So we work with the Royal Bank of Canada and Youth in Care and develop those financial literacy tools. I find them helpful for myself, so I think they're good for everybody, but check them out. They're free of charge and available in that link. And keep in mind that what Canada has announced is only words on paper. They have not changed anything yet. We need to really hold their feet to the fire so that they deliver. We also need to be cautious that we don't work towards arbitrary timelines when it comes to the long-term solution, that we take the time that's necessary for communities to fully participate in this process in what Helaina and Mary call the bottom-up approach. And that, you know, funding is really the opportunity for you to do what you've always dreamed of, but there needs to be that readiness, that capacity, that striking of partnerships that's so important. So I know that's a lot to digest in just a little while, but I want to thank Mary in particular and to the Directors Forum for organizing this space and giving us a chance to share at least some of the highlights.
We'll open the floor now to questions if anyone wants to ask any questions of Cindy, of Helaina, or of Mary.
Tracy, I see someone typed a question into the.
Okay. But why don't we start with Terry Teegee, and then I'll see what's going on in the chat.
All right. Deneza Tekuza Skyza. Masai Cleatley Dene. I just want to thank Cleatley Dene, whose territory I'm on right now. I've just been on an executive meeting in regards to the AIP about an hour ago. There is more information that needs to be shared in regards to some of my concerns, what was stated just now by Cindy about these arbitrary timelines. In regards there are two different AIPs, as Cindy said. One's on compensation, which is the to live up to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. The floor is the $40,000 per child, as far as I know, and further to that, I'm not sure about the distinction of those caregivers. I know in the negotiations that they wanted to see that they perhaps get less because they weren't the ones affected by some of these issues. But nevertheless, I think some of those terms need to be really discussed from our region. Overall, this is a good news. It's a good start. But what we need to be aware of, and the leadership, whether you're part of a delegated agency, one of my concerns is the non-delegated, the 80+ First Nations communities that aren't affiliated with any agencies, and how they're receiving the information. as part of the compensation is the Mushroom group, in determining those children who perhaps stayed their whole life in childcare, how they're compensated and how that's determined. That's another piece that needs to be worked out in terms of the Mushroom group and the class action suit. So that's really something that we need to discuss from our region. There are many other details in terms of the compensation that needs to be worked out. And I think that's one thing what's really concerning is that some of the parties that has been in negotiations or being part of this negotiations stated February 11th of this year, and that's just over a month. So I've already stated to the executive, the national chief, and to our legal team, we're going to need more time. We're going to need more time to really discuss and look at the terms of the compensation of living up to the CHRT, and also the criteria, and also looking at the overall of the class action with the Mushroom group. The second piece of the AIP is a long-term reform. And as Cindy said, there's the $2,500 that is coming. That's a good thing. That's a really good news story, that to use those resources after March 30th of this year, going into April 1st, is to utilize those funds wisely and the best way possible for many of our children. And we got to remember that this is 1991. Some of those children are turning 30, 31 years old. So moving ahead, the long-term reform is what I heard today is wanting to get something in the books or some sort of final agreement by March 31st of this year. And that timeline is very concerning, because part of the long-term reform is that there are approximately 6 to 9 First Nations groups here in British Columbia that are looking to take over jurisdiction of child welfare. And one of the things that's really concerning is Bill C-92, as we implement C-92, is looking to get that long-term resources as we take over jurisdiction of child welfare. Now in BC, with my colleagues here, Cookby Judy Wilson and Cheryl Casimir, we're part of a group with the federal and provincial government trying to work out some of those issues, which is known as a tripartite working group. One of the things that whether it's in the tripartite working group or here, is the unwillingness from the levels of government to implement long-term reform in terms of resourcing our First Nations communities to access the necessary resources to take over child welfare. What's the point if we're going to take over child welfare if we know that we're going to be under-resourced in the future? So in the end, we inadvertently become discriminating against our own children, which was the whole point of this case. So I think with many of these things, this being a good news story, it is 40 billion. There needs to be commitments to the billions of dollars that is needed in the future for all First Nations in this country. That's going to be billions of dollars. So moving ahead, that we can take over jurisdiction over child welfare and make sure our children are well taken care of. We need those resources. When this began, an offer came in September 15th and to the AFN executive. I had many concerns. That was just to take care of the CHRT, and I believe it was Jordan's principal. There was another offer at the when was it, at the end of October, and we discussed it, and that was I believe it was about 16 billion. That was to take care of the CHRT, the class action, Jordan's principal. And I said I need to know the terms, so I extended the discussions between all those parties, and the parties in the room. You got to remember, it was the AFN, the Child Care and Family Society, the federal government, the Mushroom group, NAN who intervened, and the Chiefs of Ontario who intervened. So those two last groups who intervened had a bigger voice at the table. I really wish that we intervened, BC, in some way many years ago, but that being said, it's you know, we're here, and I think we can take care of some of those issues that really concerns the British Columbia. And as we stated in our group here from the Tripart Working Group, and also from the delegated agencies and from the 204 First Nations communities, British Columbia is in a unique position. And we've always stated that, you know, we've progressed on a number of these issues quite far on child welfare. Provincially, we have Bill, the United Nations Declarations passed as law. It's been 2 years. C-92 has been passed a couple of years now, over a couple of years. Not much to report on that as well. And now federally, we have UNDRIP passed as of June of this year. So as our First Nations communities that need to be resourced to implement their Indigenous governing bodies so they can take over jurisdiction over child welfare, that's also another matter that needs to be dealt with. Because quite simply, as it states within the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have our own ways of knowing, being, and governing ourselves. And also determining who our membership is. So further to that, I think it's really important to understand that this being a good news story of 40 billion, it was very difficult to get here. Because I certainly know there were different opinions from all the parties in the room. We needed more time. And even in this last AIP, I requested an extension to December 31st to see that everything was looked after, taken care of all parties in the room. And this is where we are now. If it was up to other people in the room, this would have been done a long time ago, but there was a lot of concerns, especially from our region, because quite simply, we were unique. We were the only region in the country where we have all three at the table. We have a tripartite working group. We're working on the terms of C-92 and implementing C-92. And also too, one of the things we need to do, because the only people that have been privy to the information that the federal government has is the legal team that were in the room. So that data that's concerning your children, and I see some chiefs here in the room, has only been shown to the legal team and at the AFN and to those parties that were in negotiations. So to me, I think what needs to happen here from our region is that there needs to be a tripartite agreement on data sharing. So we make sure that all the children are accounted for. So if we look back on the common experience payments, 60 scoop, even the day schoolers, there's been those children that deserve the compensation were missed. And there's many out there. This is one thing that going off hindsight 2020, we can't miss those children. And one of the issues there was whether if they were on reserve or off reserve. And as you can well imagine, 80%, 70 to 80%, depending on which community you come from, 70, 80% of our population are in urban centers. So many of our children that are registered under a ban could be in an urban center and could have been missed in the 60 scoop settlement because most of that was addressed on reserve. So that's pre-91. So we can't let that happen again for these children, and making sure that those children are part of the class action as well. So this is a lot of information, not only from the delegated agencies and also from Cindy Blackstock shop here, but I think it's for everybody in the room, it's been very difficult in terms of trying to get everybody on the same page, and certainly one person that was really trying to get everybody in the room and not lose sight of who this is about. The children was Justice Marie Sinclair, and I did have many conversations with Murray about our position here in British Columbia, about our unique position, and about everything, the realities here. So moving forward, I've already told the AFN and the executive that the February 11th date, it's not going to work. We're going to need more time. The March 31st date, that probably isn't going to work, because we got to go out to our leadership, to our communities, to our chiefs, to the technical experts, to our legal teams, and really make it sure that we don't, that we don't do this wrong, and we have everything that from our position, from the British Columbia position, that we get it right, and making sure that these two things, as Cindy said, really breaks down to the compensation and the long-term reform. And also Jordan's principle, the data that we need for Jordan's principle. We have some of that data, but we need more data and more accurate data. And some of that has been, that I know that we've received from Helaina and from other different organizations out there is needed, and making sure that everybody is accounted for, and that the compensation goes to those children that need it, but also looking forward that those who are taking over jurisdiction are properly resourced for long-term reform. So I know there's a lot of that. A lot of this is up in the air. It is an agreement in principle, but the huge but about this is that it's the devil's in the details, and the commitment from the federal government, and how we determine really some of these issues that that are very concerning. And one of those is Directive 20-1, which is really limiting the resources for our First Nations communities to access the necessary resources. So these issues, we are pretty well versed on, at least from the BC perspective. I'm not sure about other regions though. I think Ontario has some resources and pushed, because they're at the table here. Maybe we could learn something from their position from Ontario, but nevertheless, I think we're in unique positions, because all this is driven, much of this, because we've been an active table. BC is the help from BC. So I think we've been proactive, big voice, have a lot of communities, 204 First Nations communities. So we got to make sure that we're properly represented, considering we're almost a third of the AFN. So going forward, I think it's really important that we get this right. So moving forward, look forward for more meetings. I would suggest that from our First Nations Leadership Council, we start putting these information sessions out, and as soon as we can, and one of our legal team, as well as Mary Ellen Turpella-Fawn, we're really trying to get this well digested and put positions forward, including we're very similar in terms of what Mary said, and also Cindy, in our positions, and in terms of moving ahead in the best way possible. So I'll leave it at that, Cindy, Mary, and all those at the table here. Thank you. Masito.
Just want to do a shout out to you, Regional Chief, for all your support during this time. I really have just really thankful to you for all of the work, and I'm looking forward to kind of working with everybody on the road ahead. But I just want to recognize all the work you put into it.
Definitely. Thanks, Terry. I know the frustrations that we had, Cindy, at the table. Definitely, I know Terry with his calm demeanor, but also ensuring that that political voice was there for BC was definitely helpful. I just wanted to comment on some of the work that we've done at the Caring Society, because that's what we've been doing for the last few years, is to say, okay, how do we ensure that we are making sure that all the ones that should be compensated are going to be compensated? Cindy engaged with the University of McGill, and so we do have some research. They actually came out to BC. They were talking they talked to the agencies. They've been talking to other people, the ministry and whatnot, as to how to get the proper numbers and the names as to who should be compensated. And of course, at the NAC table, again, that's at National Advisory Committee, we were talking about the importance of doing this right when we do roll out the funding to ensure that we're keeping them safe. In fact, that was one of the key things, is once we compensate and understanding that, yes, they are children at risk, they're the ones that are on the street. What are you going to do when you give 40,000 to somebody that's active in their addictions? We learned from the common experience payments. So definitely the work that we've undertaken for the last few years at the NAC has considered that. So definitely there is much more work that needs to be done. Okay.
Thanks, Mary. We have a question from the chat on regarding who's available, or who the funding is available to, and whether that only includes First Nations who have a land reserve, and only First Nations who have or are entering into a tripartite agreement under the federal legislation.
Well, I can tell you that actually what Canada's current position is if you enter into that tripartite agreement under C92, you are not eligible for the CHRT orders. It is to all First Nations communities. I'm not sure about the land base, but if you're one of those First Nations that's recognized by Canada, you'll be receiving these funds. And again, it's up to you to decide where you want to direct it. I don't know, Mary, or Helaina, if you have any more you want to add to
that. Chief Byron Louis, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. One of the things that, when I was looking at the budget and how it all rolls out, one of the things that struck me was the need for communications, because when you look at communications in a community, the majority of us are dependent on Facebook or banned newsletters or that sort of thing. And I think what we really need to have is a communication strategy that rolls out, because when you look at the individuals that are, named in this class action, they are going to need support as individuals, having that information coming out to them, their families who are going to be having to provide that support, extended families, and community as a whole. When you look at how important communications is, it simply can't be done by Facebook or by newsletter. We have to look at all sources of media and also develop some sort of communication strategy that allows not only information coming to individuals, to families and communities, but having that ability to communicate out some of the findings or some of the, the problems that are going to be associated with that. So I would really say that we really need a communication strategy. And the other one is, it sort of struck me as, about any type of components. And I understand what people are saying about not rewarding people that had abused or had hurt children. And that was the reason why they're taken out of the home. But when we actually look at the reasons why this abuse happened, in a lot of incidences, that actually comes from people that were either in care or through the residential schools, or that multi-generational effects that happened to all of us. And, that was one of the things I always say about, the residential schools, the 60 Scoop, the day scholars and everything. It does not deal with multi-generational effects. And I'm hoping that this will actually do that allows us to stop this trauma and break that cycle. And I think it's really important, but communication should be looked upon as being central to actually having an effective program of how this can be delivered and successfully, and I think that is so important. Okay, thank you.
I couldn't agree more, Chief. I think that's an essential point. I'm going to put it in the chat with the existing resources that I'm aware of on the class action right now but I've actually been reaching out myself to say what else is coming out, because I think there needs to be a lot more communication available. We're going to have to also do that on our side for the long-term reform. And one of the things that we're also looking at is how to fix the department itself so that it doesn't hurt another generation of kids. So that's part of the work that we'll be doing over the next little while. And that's why having the space to be able to involve communities in these very, very important discussions is critical. I actually, when I step back and I think this so far, what we've collectively, and I want to honor everyone who came before and was part of the struggle, even before I was on the scene or others were on the scene, but we have collectively achieved 8 times Kelowna in this one case. And it shows how the litigation and public pressure, along with political support, can make such a difference. And it seems to me that one of the things that is worthwhile doing when we catch our breath is to step back and think how we can build on this success to deal with housing and water and other types of things as well. So I just wanted to put that on the table, and I'll put these links in the chat for everyone.
Thank you, Cindy. Could be Judy Wilson. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just building off of what Regional Chief had already said, and Chief Byron raised some of the points too about communications I was going to raise, and just that we're clear about the timeline, in dealing with the 2 different agreements and the long-term reform, and just understanding, I always say that Jordan Principle, while, important and valuable, the reason it came about is because the system is broken. And they continue band-aiding the system without dealing with the inequities and the discrimination and the issues with the delivery. We still have, all of those programs that are transferred from Ottawa, and also the way they're delivered, and then the cost inequities with it. And the long-term plans are going to be really important. And yes, BC is ahead of a lot of that, but like Regional Chief was saying, we really need a lot of that data to be able to make these important decisions and changes that in the system. And I just wanted to make sure I was understanding Dr. Cindy Blackstock saying that if the bands do sign the C92 agreements, I think she said, that they would be ineligible or something like that. Was that the coordination agreement? So I wasn't sure, because we're still disentangling a lot of the information, as Regional Chief said, to make sure we're getting good briefing notes and good information to our chiefs in the province. I just wanted to make sure, because there are, I think there were 4 at the last count last year at those coordination tables. So I just wanted to make sure. And I'm just wondering, is that another discrimination because, they're wanting their jurisdiction, but they should be eligible for all the past harms that have been done and not penalized if they're signing something moving forward. I just wanted to make sure I heard that right, because I was thinking, gee, did I hear that right? And the continuation of these important forums are going to be important. We're lucky in BC, we've had all chiefs children and family provincial wide forums, and we get a lot of our direct direction from the chiefs and how we're doing everything. And in this case, though, we have the AFN, the BCFN, and the Children and Care, the Child Caring Society, and all the great work that our agencies have done as well. So it is where we're coming together to put the best recommendations, the best thinking forward in dealing with these some of these challenges that are still within these two these 2 agreements that are coming out. And then we're going to be, it looks like, deciding on that in July for the AFN Chiefs and Assembly for review and approval. So what does that look like in leading up to July to make these important decisions for our chiefs? So thank you. Those are just some of the thoughts I had. Thank you. And thank you for the presentations and the updates and all the work everyone has done on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. I wish you didn't hear properly. I wish I could say that First Nations who are drawing down jurisdiction will have full benefit of all the gains that we've collectively made through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. But unfortunately, Canada's official position is that it is no longer bound by the tribunal as soon as someone draws down jurisdiction. And the early funding agreements have not met the standard of the tribunal. We have tried to press, AFN's pressed as well, that the level of funding that First Nations with jurisdiction doesn't go below what's in the tribunal, but it's not just the level, it's the structure. And unfortunately, there are existing agreements, which in my view are below that standard. So it is an area that First Nations need to be very cautious with, not only with Child and Family Services, but also Jordan's Principle. What Canada is saying on Jordan's Principle is that if you drew down jurisdiction, for example, they say they will continue to fund you for Jordan's Principle, except for things that are in your coordination agreement. So if you used a broad word like prevention, say, in your coordination agreement, it would be open to Canada to say, well, look, that was already funded in your prevention budget, even if you never really intended for that to be funded. So I think that we need to really look at this question. We'd like at the Caring Society, what we want to do is make available to First Nations as a choice the funding package through the CHRT as a floor, and then they can build on top of that. But we certainly don't want to see people getting, as you're quite rightly pointing out, Chief, discriminated against by that process. So that's a huge issue that's currently happening. And I'd really caution people who are sitting at those C92 tables. And on the July date with AFN, I think the regional chief's probably in the best position to talk about that.
Yeah, well, those dates, much of this was brought upon me just the day before, and even today, some of these dates that were brought forward. I believe the February 11th was brought forward by the motion group to try to get the compensation out as soon as possible. I don't disagree that the compensation should go out as soon as possible, but I just wanted to err on the side of caution to make sure that those terms and the details are laid out in terms of who's being compensated and all those that are eligible for the class action are properly addressed in terms of our position from British Columbia. And I think I think the National Chief agrees with me, and to their credit, I want to thank Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse, who was just recently elected in the last few months and took this upon herself as a file, and Regional Chief Kevin Hart, who was on this file for many years, and also Chief Bobby Cameron and Chief Norman Yakalea, who was part of the AFN team. And also too, previous National Chiefs Perry Bellegarde, and where this all started was with National Chief Ainchet, Sean Atleo, way back in 2015, 2016. So I think it's, you recognize all those, and all those leadership previous that were on this, fighting this fight, need to be recognized for all the good work and continuing to have that vision and to continue to push this to where we're at now. So I think as we move forward, I would say that we would be proposing more dates for engagement sessions, perhaps by region or different regions in British Columbia. I don't know, we'll figure something out. But nevertheless, I think it comes back to what Chief Byron Lewis said, that communications piece, and making sure that those children aren't missed, and making sure that all leadership understand what this AIP means, and be, I would say, more on the cautious side. It is a good development, but the devil's in the details. Thank you.
I think also just to note that there is the National Advisory Committee on Child and Family Service Reform that still is in existence, and there's still a lot of work to do. We've already across, and again, these are like subject matter experts from across Canada, And so one of the things that when we talked about compensation, those are the safeguards that we kept bringing into place, and we just have to wait and see. But absolutely, like I think that, you know, once the money gets out the door, like we've always said that we haven't deviated, that 40,000 would be the very, very floor. And then anything up over and above that is great. But I think if there is a money that's starting to flow out, like say February 11th, if that's what the target date is, that there has to be a window, like a generous window to say, okay, in case we've missed somebody, and there has to be some type of a mechanism in order for those claimants to come forward and to be supported to come forward. I absolutely agree with Chief Louis, you know, that the communications to find out those ones, you know, especially when they are on the street. And we see it here. We're at the Skies at the youth center. We see all our the kids in care, former kids in care, especially through this cold winter, you know, like how are we going to support them? What can we do? So we definitely need, there's a lot of work that needs to be done right on the ground level by nations and by agencies to identify those ones as well. But I think we have some work that we've started, but definitely there's a long way to go. So we need a large window of time to say, yes, we can start the flowing. These are the ones that we know for certain, but this is a mechanism for those ones that will come forward later.
Thanks, Mary. Judith Sayers, do you have a question?
Yes, hello everyone, and Happy New Year. I am the president of the New Channel Tribal Council, and I would like to thank everyone for many years for their contributions and work that they've had to put this on the table. For me, I'm feeling like there's a lot of details that we don't know, and I'm just wondering, number one, are we going to be able to read these agreements? It sounds like there are two agreements, and one agreement is by AFN and the Child Care Society, Cindy, that you represent. So, and there'll be a motion in July to accept this agreement. So I guess, do your directors of your society, do they approve this as well as AFN? And then I know federal court and has to approve this in the CHRT. So then there seems to be a second agreement that I'm not really understanding. It sounds like there's a bunch of people negotiating or negotiated the compensation. And so who approves that final agreement? Who is negotiating the last details? Do we have input into who gets compensated? And I like the idea of the last speaker, was it Mary, saying that, we really need to leave some funding open for those that we don't know. Because I understand from some of the press conferences that the federal government did do kind of a survey. I don't know if they had specific names, but it's like $115,000 people for Dorrance principal and compensation, and then another 100,000. Anyway, around 200,000. But do we have specifics, or are we able to bring specifics? And so I guess for me, I really would love to see these agreements so I can fully understand and being able to advise us. And then I guess I'm not really too clear as well on long-term reform. And I was listening to the conversation with Judy Wilson and Cindy. So if you have drawn down jurisdiction, you are not entitled to any money or any role in long-term reform. I'm just not sure on that. So just wanted some clarifications on some of those. Would appreciate some and look forward to more information sessions so we can discuss this more thoroughly. Thank you.
I could answer on the AIP. I hopefully I could figure something out by tomorrow to get you a copy. You might have to sign a non-disclosure. I'm not sure, but anyways, yourself and there's a number of leadership that wanted to see the actual AIP. So I'll try to get that going here soon. I think what are we under BC 20-1? Those types of arrangements, which is limiting our ability to access resources. So I think in terms of going ahead, and this is on the long-term reform, it has to be long-term. funding that you know, as we draw down jurisdiction. This is really what we need to really push back upon, is making sure that those that draw down jurisdiction get the necessary resources and access. And this is why we need good data to make informed decisions going ahead, whether it's Jordan principle or taking over jurisdiction. And this is where Helaina and those that do a lot of statistical work, we need that type of information. The more information we have, that, especially when that comes back to your community, your perhaps your region, the more accurate it will be. Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you, Chief. Nice to see you again. You're one of the people that I remember from my days in BC when I was working at the Caring Society there, and it's an honor to see you again. A couple of things. One is that it's been an agreement in principle, it's non-binding. So our board supports that. But what we are looking for really is the final agreement. And that's where the devil is in the details. And of course, that has not been developed. We take the position that that really needs to be informed by community participation in that phase 3 that Helaina is talking about, and in other fora. So that's where we're concerned about those timeframes, like especially in BC with the climate emergencies. It's, you know, people are just trying to make do, let alone turn their mind to participating. And how do we over the long stretch really support child and family services in a community-based and culturally based way? And how do we actually support ensuring equity and other services that are currently being covered by Jordan's principle? That's really what long-term reform is. And that third question about stopping the department from hurting another generation of kids, right? This has to be the last time they do it, but we have to fix them first. So as far as we're concerned, with all communities, regardless of what jurisdiction role model you want, we want to include you in long-term reform. And you can actually, as a First Nation, if you're interested in C92, or maybe you've signed an agreement, you could participate in that phase 3 work that Helaina is talking about to inform more of your community members and yourself about what levels of funding you might need over the longer run. The roadblock is the Canadian government taking that, what I think is in a very unhelpful position, in saying that we're free of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders the moment you draw down jurisdiction. I think that decision about whether Canada is bound by those orders or not, when a nation draws down jurisdiction, ought to be the decision of the nation, not the decision of Canada. So that's really the key piece where I think there would be really helpful. I know Scott Smith, Mary knows him well, has done some research into this. Some people believe that having the CHRT orders bind Canada in some way might erode self-government. I don't see it that way. I think the bigger risk is actually having a First Nation draw down jurisdiction and as the regional chief is saying, not have the resources to be able to make it happen for their families. I think that's a big serious risk, but we need to put all these ideas on the table. And Mary, I think Scott's volunteered to kind of present this information to anyone who's interested, hasn't he? So I just want to leave the floor open to you to.
I think, and thanks for the questions, because definitely the importance for us to ensure that when we're talking about jurisdiction, and just to be really clear, Carriacou County, we've been down this road for numerous years. We already had a jurisdiction model way before C92, and we helped draft the national federal enabling legislation, which wasn't accepted, unfortunately, and then we ended up with C92. So being very well aware of that. One of the things that we wanted to ensure, and we kept seeking answers from Canada, is that we see prevention, as I said, as holistic. And it follows the life cycle, or from cradle to grave. And that's what we looked at for the funding. So what Dr. Helaina Gaspard, she came from that place to say, okay, let's look at prevention for the whole piece. Now, what we found, even up until a few months ago, is that Canada was saying, well, that wouldn't be an eligible expense within sort of the coordination agreement. And we're saying, well, no, it has to be. This is how we see prevention. So the fear that we have, and definitely, is when we go to that coordination agreement, where we can't accept anything less than what the communities are saying. And they're saying culture, holistic well-being, which includes health, maternal child health, all those pieces that are traditionally considered health. it has to be within our in our agreement. And trust me, you know, when the work that we're doing at the Secretariat, the Indigenous Child and Family Secretariat for in the province of BC, we're really fortunate to have our body because we're expecting to assist all those nations, even the ones that aren't part of a delegated agency, to help with the practice support, legal support, policy support, operations support, all of those pieces. Because so when they start, you know, they're going to receive more, the top up, the $2,500 more. Well, we've been doing this. We're all in this together. All 204 nations, we're all brothers, sisters, we're all related. So all the years of experience that we've received at the agencies, we're going to share that with all the nations and help them support, because we know that's we're stronger together. And so all those years and experiences, as you know, we had Maurice Squires, Deb Foxcroft, Warner Adam, like Cindy used to be out here in BC. So we have generations of learned experiences that we can provide to the rest of the all the nations in BC. The one thing that I had heard the question around the nations that aren't part of a delegated agency, yes, you do receive the $2,500 top up above and beyond what you get right now. So that's really important. The important thing is that we really have to stick together in BC to fight back around this arbitrary decision where C92 wouldn't incorporate CHRT, these orders, because we have to. One of the things that, again, politically that needs to happen, and I've been pushing the MCFD and the Premier to do, is to adopt the principles or to adopt the CHRT orders, so that prevention based on actuals in the province, because right now in the province of BC, there's inequity in provincial funding and in federal funding. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. So look forward to meeting with everybody so that we could start saying in BC, what are our next steps?
Thanks, Mary. We're just starting to run over time, so I'll just leave it open to Mary, Cindy, and Helaina if you have any other closing comments.
Well, I just want to really thank you all for your years of support to get us to this place, but we're not done yet. We have to land this, and we have to do that consultation and work with you over the next few months and years, however long it takes, to make sure that we actually take this across the finish line for First Nations kids. We're going to be doing our best. Actually, I was just looking at a draft of an information sheet. We're going to do our best to try and keep you informed as we go along. If there's any questions, we're in lockdown, unfortunately, in Ontario, like a serious lockdown now. But I will put how to get a hold of us. And if you have any questions after this, please don't hesitate. And of course, it's been an absolute honor working with the regional chief and with Mary and with Helaina. And I think that we have, I think this could be a very good day for kids.
Thank you, Cindy. And before we close, we'll have Kelly come over and do a closing for us.
Tracy, can I just talk about some of the next steps that we're going to be doing? So, like, along with Cindy, we're going to, just so that everybody that's on here, we're definitely going to be working together to have more information sessions for sure. We just wanted to do this right away because I was receiving a lot of calls already from many nations and wondering about it. So we thought we would just have this, and we're lucky because nobody else in the country will have Dr. Helaina Gaspard and Dr. Cindy Blackstock to do this, but definitely we'll get them back. But we are going to be providing information sheets that we have at the Caring Society. There are right now, I just wanted you to know, if you go on the First Nations Caring Society website, you'll see a really nice timeline of all of the things that we've been talking about right since we first started the court case. It's done in nice information sheets. We have amazing staff that get it done and they do it really quickly. And Cindy, of course, is just always, this is what she does. So we have these wonderful information sheets that will be coming out. The Indigenous Child and Family Service Secretariat will also be providing support to do that work and getting more information. And then I think what we're going to do, I think we do need to have a tripartite meeting so that we could have a coordinated effort moving forward in BC. So I just want to thank you, Cindy, and Helaina, Regional Chief Terry, and all the ones that really helped us get to this day. So thank you, Masai.
Thank you, Mary. And Kelly, I'll turn to you.
Okay. I just thank you so much, Cindy, Helaina, Mary, Regional Chief Terry, and really a big thanks to each and every one of you on this call today, and even those who did not make the call, just for all of the hard work, the good hearts, and the efforts that have brought us to this point. It's just absolutely amazing and really hopeful, and for us to move forward. So I would like to just offering a closing prayer, and as we move on with our day here, gracious Creator, we thank you for making this day successful. As we close for the day, may the pathways be clear to keep everyone safe. We give thanks for the words that were shared today, for the time that was shared together, and the potential for all good things to honor our children and families and reduce further pain and suffering. May we all have it in our hearts and abilities to put into practice what we have discussed and we've learned here today. May this all stir our hearts to continue to act with good intentions to positively impact the lives of our children and our families and our friends and the rest of the world. I wish that you all to walk softly, stay safe, and may you all fall in love with life again. I'm forever grateful for all your creative minds, and I wish you all peace. Wachokio, Waicho.
Akshan, thank you.
Happy New Year. See ya.
Thank you, everyone.